Okay, so hello and welcome back, everybody. This is part two of our conversation with FourArrows concerning what the possibility of an Indigenous worldview and its impact on our on modernity, I'll say. We had a conversation about FourArrows' book. Recent book about that, and there were some questions that we didn't get to. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand this over to Kurt, who's got some questions that he's interested in pursuing with you, FourArrows, and then we'll see how the conversation unfolds from there.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, first, let me just express my gratitude, and I know to speak on Drew and Carolyn's behalf as well, for you taking time to be with us. The first conversation was so rich and so enlivening. I just really appreciate you being with us again. So thank you. And then the other thing that I want to say is your book that you co-wrote with Garcia Narvaez, Restoring the Kinship Worldview, is really landed deeply for me, and it occurs almost as revolutionary. And I really thank you for the thinking and the conversation the two of you had, and the quotes throughout the book. I just felt were fantastic and rich and enlivening and illuminating. And I have questions. Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome, FourArrows. Thank you. And as I read through this, I had questions. Some are kind of broad sort of questions, and some are more specific. So I wanted to jump in a bit here to get your thinking, to get more kind of maybe a deeper cut at how we restore a kinship worldview to this world that we live in, which, is a long way from the kinship worldview that is talked about in the book. And I think the first thing that I wanted to ask you about is in relationship to words are sacred, the Precept 12, words are sacred. And I was listening to a podcast yesterday on the podcast Emergence. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular podcast. It was a great essay by a woman, and one of the things that she talked about was the kind of in the colonializing of the West, the railroads coming through, the basically extermination of the buffalo. And she talked about the number of treaties that the indigenous people had signed with the United States government that were summarily broken. Just one after another, broken treaties. So in the context of words are sacred, and in bringing my particular view that I think Drew and Carolyn share with me, that without integrity, nothing works. And it occurs for me as this massive broken integrity, broken word with the indigenous people that we're trying to build a culture on top of. So I'd love to know what your thoughts are about that, and anything that you see as a way forward, given really the broken foundation upon which we're trying to build something here.
With indigenous people and with ourselves. What you just said, Kurt, you could close the show down right now and publish it, and it would be worth its weight in gold. This is foundational. I wrote an entire chapter for our book out of the University of Notre Dame and a conference that we had on indigenous know-how. That the whole chapter was about truth. and truth seeking. The as a member, as a hookah of the Lakota, I don't know the language well at all, but my medicine horse Teoshpaye, when I was on Pine Ridge, before Carolyn took me away, and much to my wife's joy, although it was tough for me, because it was a tough place there. But everything that I saw in the group of Sundancers who I, caroused with, if you will, this was basic. This was foundational. No matter what the dialogue, and truth. I like Parker Palmer's definition of education as truth and truth seeking, and it's an eternal conversation about things that matter, conducted with passion and discipline. It's so multifaceted. You really can't stand on the table and yell it out so much, but you know it when you see it, and you know what isn't when it's not there. But it was such an important part of indigeneity and in the cultures that I've stayed and spent a lot of time with, that it is revolutionary, if you will, in a post-truth world that we live in.
Yeah.
I wrote a book. I'm happy to send you the Dropbox of it because it's out of press, but it was called The Bum's Rush, The Selling of Environmental Backlash, with phrases and fallacies of Rush Limbaugh. And I list all of the strategies that Republicans and Democrats alike use to get around this idea of truth in a hypnotic way, in a hegemonic way. And I wrote it for environmentalists, but mostly lawyers bought it. Although one of the people that was inspired by it asked me to sit with the surviving members of the Manhattan Project. They're all in their late 80s, to hear their truths about whether what they did was right. And it's in a video. It was $1 million project called Half Lives. So I'm kind of beating around the bush here to get to the center of this, but the center of it for Indigenous peoples is in the languaging. Indigenous languages, as you know, are verb based. They're very difficult to concretize and simplify. So, an oak tree isn't an oak tree. An oak tree is a different series of words based on whether the wind is blowing or there's a nest in it. And so we might not necessarily forgive, but we might, understand that our European languages make it much easier to tell something that isn't true, or to say something that isn't true, even innocently. When I taught hypnosis at UC Berkeley, and I would teach people, words that people say to themselves can be untruthful, and let's talk about that, because that creates great psychological stress. So a woman who's obese and comes for hypnosis to get in control of that, if I would ask her, what do you say to yourself if you're naked and you look in the mirror? And if she says, I see I'm a fat person. We say, well, let's get truthful with our words here, because in the English language, that makes sense to somebody, but it's really not truthful. Well, a little bit of talking back and forth, and pretty soon the next day they come and I said, what do you say when you saw yourself yesterday? I saw a beautiful woman who happens to have, at this point in time, a little more adipose tissue on them than they think is healthy. Now you notice there was that was a lot more words, and
Yeah.
Well, that's how Indigenous languages are, and why they are, because they come from the process of the flora and fauna and the geography. And so, broken treaties. Wow. I'm sure you know that the Lakota we still have not. And I say we because they tell me my spirit will not go to my Irish ancestors or my Cherokee. Every year when I was there on Pine Ridge, I went to the meetings. Every year they come up. There's I don't know how much money it is, but it was $123 million awarded to the Lakota in 1972. And it could be worth $1 billion. I don't know. I'll have to find out. But every year they get together and say, look, we have third world poverty. We have, we know all that. I won't go into details. And yet, here's this money. What the men especially would say, you know what we could do with this? We could have schools better, and we could do this, and we could get the roads so school buses aren't sliding off in the winter in the mud, and they have good arguments. But then the women speak, and the women say, shall we sell our birthright? Shall we sell our land? Shall we sell the Black Hills? So if you're not sure what I'm talking about, it was only 2 times in history that I know of where the Supreme Court of the United States found in favor of indigenous peoples. In my book on learning the language of conquest out of the University of Texas, Vine Deloria Jr. wrote his last chapter, and it was entitled Conquest Masquerading as Law. And he makes this point. And so, this idea of the treaty being broken, well, that's what happened. It went to the Supreme Court of the United States because attorneys came and said, you know what? The last big treaty that was broken was the treaty that was so famous because it has the words, this will be your land until the grass stops growing and the water stops running. And that was the treaty that gave the Lakota people their Black Hills, the Pahasapa. And then, of course, when gold was discovered, the treaty was broken like that, right?
Yeah.
So they went to the courts, and the Supreme Court found in favor of the Lakota. The only other time that it happened, by the way, was when Andrew Jackson, forced my blood people on the Trail of Tears. Supreme Court was involved because a lot of non-Indian and Indian attorneys went there. They were neighbors, and they said this is illegal. The Cherokee have the right to stay on these lands. And of course, the famous words of Jackson were, the Supreme Court doesn't have the cavalry, I do, and the Trail of Tears. But they won the case. Right. Well, in the same way that in the 70s, we won the case, and we were offered $123 million. It was refused. And like I'm saying, every year it's been refused because of the power of truth. And if that's our land and it's sacred, our ancestors' blood is on it, we emerged from the caves on it, all this stuff, I don't care that they got Mount Rushmore on it. I don't care that there's $1 million homes and casino. All I know is we won the truth. And we're now shown that in your court of the great United States have said that the truth is that there was a violation of the truth in the breaking of that treaty. So
let me ask you a question here. So I mean, there's just so many different ways we can go on this particular thing, but I have a question regarding this about the whole notion of land ownership. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and I may be way off base here, but it doesn't seem to me that in the indigenous way of thinking, land is owned by the people residing there. They're from that land, and you speak a lot about being of a place, but the notion of ownership seems to me to be a Western notion that's been imposed upon the people that were already here before the Western colonials showed up. Does that make sense?
You've pretty much articulated the position of the women leaders who always have the rule at the end of the day that we're not going to do it, because that's what they're saying. If we sell the land as a monetary thing,
yes,
we have lost our spiritual truths about that no one can own the mountains and the rivers and the land and all that, right? That's exactly the argument that they give.
Yeah, right. So then from your perspective and with the depth of knowledge that you bring, what's our way forward? Because as best as I can tell, not only is nothing really being done of any significance, but the US government isn't even acknowledging, as best as I can tell, isn't even acknowledging the depth of broken word, lack of honor that's gone on here. So how do we navigate a way forward to restore a kinship worldview, given what we're operating on top of?
Well, you're right. There are very small gestures. I mean, the Pope even has said something about, we were wrong with the doctrine of discovery, but it hasn't changed anything because the doctrine of discovery is still embedded in the constitution of 3 countries. But there are these gestures. There's the recognition of boarding school catastrophes and deaths. And so people are, in the Truth and Reconciliation report of Canada, that wasn't done by the government. It was forced, for the government to do that study.
Right.
But still, so these truths come out. But denial is not a river in Egypt, right? As they say. And that's where we are mostly. It's like I just sent you the little piece that I wrote for Indian Country Today, and I opened up with the quote that really gets to the point of this, and we have to remember that we are in a post-truth world, and that our words are no longer sacred, and so we use them to defend ourselves and to defend our positions. So how to get around that? Well, looking at all 40 of the worldview science precepts, because they're so interrelated, and if they all are in balance with the dominant worldview, then automatically you can't do otherwise than to say what you believe in the best way is as close to the truth as that you can say it, until you open your mind and heart and listen and look and observe and maybe even change that and say, even though I was meaning to say the truth, now I recognize that wasn't the truth. Those things happen automatically, and it's one of the things that folks are telling me. I got 3 doctoral students working on how to implement this. The Veterans for Peace Executive Committee, and they're saying, we're getting into dialogue mostly. That was one of the comments that. Great.
So
could
please. Drew.
Yeah, I just want to clarify something. I think it would be useful. The word truth. And I want to offer, maybe I'm curious because I have a particular approach to it that I've gotten, that I've written about in Speaking Being, and so one sort of level of truth, which could be, I would call it sort of like a modernist view of truth, is that truth is statements that correspond to states of affairs in the world. Right, that would be a kind of a truth, that I said it's raining, it's not raining, that's false. That's the criteria for true or false. But then there's a whole other order of truth, which is at the level, I would say, of just being, like what's so. And then maybe even not, I wouldn't say beyond that, but alongside that, another order of truth or another realm of truth, which is just disclosure of, I don't know if you want to call it self or word, or which is a little bit edging on on mysticism in terms of truth. So I was listening for which truth were you referring to when you're saying truth, FourArrows. Not that my schema has to apply to that, but I'm just sort of like having a conversation with that and looking at, well, what is it that are you saying that truth is? And when you're using that word, because it's a polyvalent word, truth is.
And if I could add one other piece to what Drew just said, also with bearing in mind the verb-based languaging of the indigenous people versus a noun-based languaging of kind of the colonial world? How does the kind of truth you're talking about, particularly bearing that in mind?
And then could I add a third thing?
Yeah.
Because you referenced this quote from Winona LaDuke, I think it might be helpful if that was read so that people watching the podcast, because to me that quote really does point to what you're referencing when you speak about truth.
Good idea. Good idea. Why don't you read it real quick?
Oh, me? You want me to read it? Okay, I'll read it.
Yeah, I got it in.
All right. Euro-Americans in the United States can't talk about Gaza because we can't talk about Israel, because we can't talk about the fact that the world is not suffering from an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but that the world is suffering from the fact that Europe has never been able to deal with its Jewish question without some sort of intense barbarity and horror from the Inquisition to the Holocaust. And that Europe, in particular, Great Britain, the masters of divide and conquer, solved the problem by supporting the radical terrorist, extremist Zionists and their mad plan to resettle the homeland. We can't talk about Israel because we can't talk about Wounded Knee, because we can't talk about Sand Creek or Carlisle boarding school, because we can't talk about forced sterilization or smallpox, blankets or Kit Carson and his scorched earth policy in the Southwest, because we have Andrew Jackson on our $20 bill, because we are one huge settlement on stolen land. We can't talk about Israel because we are Israel.
So thank you for reading that. And it does tie together the answers to Drew's question in a lot of ways. You know, our word for this concept of truth is v1i2, and it's really, boy, so, you know, these words are really hard to translate even for people that speak fluently, but it means being honest about yourself and the world around you. And you know, there is an ultimate truth, but nobody can really know it. It's a mystery. And so if there's this ultimate mystery truth, and we've got our individual truths, but we have to do our best to be honest about ourselves and the world around us, and be able to. I mean, one of the stories I really I've always gotten a kick out of, that Tom Cooper writes about in his book, A Time Before Deception, where he talks about this very topic. And the story is that when the Lakota, and I never knew this before I read Tom's book, when the Lakota first were lied to by the Eurocentric or the European colonists and treaty breakers, they held healing ceremonies for them because they thought that they had a mental illness and they could not describe their realities.
Right.
You know, and I just think that that's amazing, until eventually they went, no, this is more or less intentional, right? It's not an accidental illness, but, you know, it's just like it relates to these other worldview precepts like greed and, you know, and power and all that kind of stuff, right? And so, you know, they recognize we all have our own individual perspectives, and the truth is multifaceted, like Parker Palmer's quote is all about. But to be in truth is really a project that is about seeing reality and expressing it as best as you can. And like I said earlier, it's, you know, it's knowing it when you see it or when you don't. Now we've got courts that say, do you promise to tell the truth, and that the juries are supposed to decide. Well, we know what they decide is all based on the untruthfulness of most of the words spoken by both parties to try to convince somebody of a concept. But so your last point, Drew, was, are we touching into spiritual realms or metaphysical realms when Indigenous people think of truth? Well, of course, absolutely, because we are spirits inhabiting a body, and the spirits and the truths of the animals that don't lie. Honesty is one of the sacred goals in indigeneity, because we can't romanticize that they had people that were greedy and jealous and envious and did all those things. That's why their origin stories have taught them how to live according to nature, because nature doesn't lie, right? So it is spiritual also.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wow. I mean, so we could just say, like, going back to her quote, if we could just be truthful with one another, we could get through probably most of our crises and get to a place of relative harmony again.
Well, but it's one of the things that I've been meditating on, and I'm sure anybody who has approached this has had to meditate on this. We can't talk about Israel because we are Israel, which is basically pointing to that the entirety of my existence, my everyday existence, is itself enframed within a modernist structural hegemonic worldview, in which indigeneity as a possibility exists as a quaint other world that I would have to completely surrender, renounce, whatever.
Well, let me jump in, because remember, the preface of the worldview chart is very clearly not a binary worldview perspective. It's a non-dualistic worldview. So instead of rejecting everything that you have and know in this realm of technology and materialism, the goal is to look, well, what are the precepts? What are those precepts? Is it, the one precept about a priority on self and self-gain versus community? Okay, let's look at where's the balance points on those things. So I just really want to make sure that we're not talking about eliminating this worldview that has dominated us for about 10,000 years, and the philosophies that have created a lot of amazing things, but at the same time, the price we've paid for it is obviously too much. So anyway, just wanted to get that in.
But I get that. I get that. But at the same time, though, if I, really am honest with myself, that I am responsible for the lack of honor that has broken the world, that's my word.
We're enjoying the fruits of that broken honor.
And we're living out of integrity, mistaking it for working.
Yeah.
All of us are in contradiction and hypocrisy. Yeah. I experience it and have to deal with it on my own self all the time. I was not going to go back to Oregon, and one of the reasons for it, to help my wife bring things back in 2 weeks, one of my reasons for it was the footprint. The carbon footprint. Don't really need to go. She can get a bigger suitcase, right? And all that. And then for other reasons, I'm going. I'm a hypocrite. So no, we can't escape that. But by being truthful about it, we can move towards rectifying it.
Mm-hmm. And it speaks to Precept 22, responsibility emphasis. When you say that
emphasizing rights, right?
Right. The dominant view is overemphasized rights and underemphasized responsibility. And there's there's something in here about looking at our own responsibility and emphasizing where we're responsible or causing the matter, and then having actions shaped by looking from responsibility and really dialing back down the notion of rights.
I love that you bring that up. Going to the Lakota Supreme Court, having been awarded the money, in a way, their rights were supported. Their rights were supported, but the women folk got into what the responsibility was for living in truth, right?
Yes. Living in balance, living in truth.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, I got goosebumps.
Yeah.
I know it's really good. I've taken a lot of notes from the book, and I have them posted in various places. One of the things that really strikes me is to be in balance is what to attend to, and that calls into question. I mean, that speaks right to responsibility. So when I'm being responsible, there's a certain balance that's possible that is not possible when I'm emphasizing or looking for what are my rights here.
Let's look at this situation that we're facing right now. Everyone is dealing with rights. Did they have the right to bomb this? Did they have the right to bomb it? Do they have the right to defend? Do they have the right to retaliate? Do they have the right? If they were responsible, they would recognize the horror of any murder of children and women, the horror of continuing it, and they would take responsibility to bury the hatchet and to go forward, right? That's a responsibility emphasis as opposed to a right emphasis.
And I think in our culture, the notion of responsibility and the notion of blame get collapsed.
Mhm.
And so then we have a very, very weak relationship to responsibility because we don't want to take the blame. It wasn't my fault. I didn't do it. Versus looking from where can I be responsible for this?
Right. And then we get into the whole idea of punishment and revenge, which are all the rights. The great story of Ella Deloria, where she describes two teenagers that got in a fight and one murdered.
Right. Really powerful.
So, that was a responsibility notion as opposed to this idea of rights. Not that the rights aren't important, I'm not saying that, but it's the emphasis again on the worldviews. It's always about the emphasis to bring a flowing balance that's closer to what the true way of being in this world is, that the trees teach us and the oceans teach us and the rivers and the animals.
Really good.
See, so we can close now, and everybody can go, all right, from now on, bless my wife's heart. I love her. She gets more beautiful every day. But she has a tendency to say things that are not true with complete innocence, with complete I didn't do that, as sort of an early childhood reaction to something, right? But even though I know it's a complete, you did because I watched you do it, right? Or something like that. It's like I have to make an issue of it, and so she just, poor B, of course she gets back at me if I do that, but no, it is a task, and we need to really understand its importance and do our best. I had talked to you on one of our previous ones about the co-authored book I did with Walter Block, and Alice Walker throwing it in the waste can. Did I mention that or no?
I don't recall. Yeah.
Okay. So with this idea in mind and all the vitriol going back and forth with claims of truth and all this, I thought there's got to be a way to stop it. So I had come across a reading from a very prolific author named Walter Block out of Loyola. He's a endowed professor of economics. Oh, it just burned me up to hear him read his. He refers to himself as a Jewish atheist libertarian. And his libertarian view is very, very, right wing, if you will.
Yeah.
So I called him up and I said, look, would you write a book with me? And the book's out. And the book's called Differing Worldviews. Two Scholars Argue Cooperatively about justice in higher education. And he's a better writer than I am. And when you can go online on YouTube and see our presentation at the Social Justice Center, Doer Social Justice Center at St. Louis University. And you can hear us talking. Well, when we did our book signing, he had more fans than me in St. Louis, and they would come up to me and say things like, for a lefty, you're not bad, or something like that, and then my fans would go up to him and say, Dr. Block, I really disagree with you believing that only humans have intrinsic value and everything else on earth is utilitarian. I can't tell you how much I disagree with that, but sir, thank you for working with and having these dialogues with FourArrows with the attitude and heart you do. Well, I thought that was a really good thing. And so my neighbor and friend Alice Walker lives here in Mexico. And I play music with her former partner, a trumpet player. And we used to jam once a week. So I go over and I got an autographed copy for her, right? And I give it to her. And you already know what happened. She looked at it for about 20 seconds and threw it right in the waste can in front of me. And I went, Alice, why did you do that? And she says, you're in bed with the devil. I said, he's written as many books as I have. Come on, he already got the word out. But the vitriol that we're seeing,
Yes.
It was minimized because we were both truthful. I mean, my wife says, don't ever write a book like that again, because I have to admit, like when he said things like that, I had said, well, wait a minute, you think that if we privatize whales, that's the only way to save them, And then ultimately I thought, and I didn't do this as a debate, because it was my idea to do cooperative argumentation. I said, so Walter, help me understand. It sounds like you're saying only humans have intrinsic value. And he wrote back and said, FourArrows, this has been a refreshing experiment for me. I've learned from you. You've learned from me. I'm really enjoying this, but I can't believe you asked me that question. Of course, only humans have intrinsic value. And what hit me, right away, I wanted to go on the attack. I wanted to, to be debating. But my wife, she said, this was your idea, And so, but ultimately, it made me realize, and he and I still talk about it, we become friends, strange bedfellows that we are, that this is our capitalist system, is based on that sentence. When you really think about it, if a corporation has a choice of polluting the river or making $1 million for the quarterly report, that's the utilitarian, the river doesn't have intrinsic value, etc. So anyway, I think that this is a fascinating part of indigeneity, and that when I was with the Ramori Cimarron people, and when I had a translator, some of the kind of arguments that the people got into, it was so beautiful to see the frankness and the compassion and the humor built into it before the conclusions were over with, right? To see it in real time, in spite of differences. Yeah.
I think we could talk for days.
The question is, how do we get people to begin to really do this metacognitive awareness of why they are in trouble, why they have unhappiness, why they have problems, why, if there's something that's not quite feeling right, do they have it? What's the source of their strong beliefs, right? And when they look at that in terms of the 40 precepts, then they can begin to go, you know what? I see that. And then if we use trance-based learning, which are built into at least two of the precepts, to either have the ability to go back and look at those things as a metacognitive step, if you can't get there otherwise, go back, with this, this going back in time kind of a thing. Then use it again for transforming the now new belief into the reality of it with an in vivo exposure that then will kind of concretize it in the brain synapses. I mean, that's sort of a process that we have to.
So how do we do that, right? So in Precept 14, you talk about complementary duality, and the big thing I got out of that was balance. and
Howard Tice was to call it flowing balance.
Yes, nice. And given that the world that we live in, by many accounts, is just wildly out of balance. I mean, if you look at eight people have the combined wealth of half the population on the planet. You look at how little space we're leaving for the wildlife, for non-human based animals. I mean, you can look in countless directions to see how out of balance we are. From your perspective, again, how do we start to get ourselves back into balance? Because it seems to me that's critical for a restoration of the kinship worldview.
Well, looking at complementarity as a possibility is already so different in our thinking, right? We're either with us or against us, right or wrong. Yeah. So thinking about complementary, what does that mean? What does that mean in a relationship? Okay, I seem to feel and think that everything you're doing is wrong and the opposite of what's right. How, if I just change that and go, okay, let me look at what you're, like I did with Walter, right? What he did with me. So that's an important step. The concept of hypnosis is the most underused force in existence. And even though I know I mentioned it, trance-based learning, it just goes in and out, really, because, no, you cannot describe any better reason why our intelligent species is polluting its own drinking water and its own air, right, than to look at the phenomenon of mass hypnosis, of the phenomenon of hypnosis. My book I had a book in 1991 called Patient Communication for First Responders that Norman Cousins, the UCLA psychoneuroimmunologist, endorsed and got published by Random, not by Random House, but by Macmillan. And it was banned. I was speaking to 1,500 emergency room physicians in Australia, and they came at me at lunchtime and said, "We can't order your book." I called up and they said, "Dr. Jacobs, it's been banned." Actually, they didn't. They said it was remaindered, and I didn't know what that word meant. And it was put back on the shelves, right? Because some guys said this should be used only by licensed physicians, trained and certified by the American Academy of Clinical Hypnosis. Now, I was vice president of the Northern California Society of Clinical Hypnosis when I wrote the book. So it was banned. Well, last week, Routledge of London just published a revision of it with one of my doctoral students who's a paramedic. This time we had an internet to use for proving that you can stop bleeding and you can stop blood pressure by saying, like if you guys drive home tonight and I hope this doesn't happen, you come upon a Volkswagen that's in a crash and it's kind of bent up, and you come up to the window and there's a young lady in it hemorrhaging, and you can walk up to that car. You can't open it because it's you can get on the phone, call the ambulance, call 911, and you take a moment to get your confidence. Take a big deep breath. You walk up to that car, especially the four of us. We can say, this is Dr. Kopp, right? Doctor. Because keeping in mind this concept that indigenous people learn from animals, during times of fear or stress, we become hyper able to or hyper suggestible to receive communication from perceived trusted authority figures. So with that in mind, and that they were in spontaneous hypnosis for the first hour of trauma, you can walk up and say, I've called the ambulance, it's on its way, the fire department will be here to open the door for you. So, but right now, you're hemorrhaging and we want to get that bleeding stopped. So I want you to listen to me carefully. When I count to 3, go ahead and stop your bleeding. You say it matter-of-factly as if, 1, 2, 3. 90% of the time during that first hour, that person can control their own autonomic nervous system, and via that message, they will do it, right? So this is powerful. Now, Indigenous people knew this. I mentioned to you last time, ceremony is all about that. That's what ceremony is. And, I recently had somebody on the 14th of October for the solstice. We did our Nipi ceremony, our sweat house, purification lodge. And there was a woman who was really quite amazing with the work that she's doing to try to clean the Congo River. And she said, I really want to do this ceremony, but I'm claustrophobic. And I was over yesterday morning and I saw your lodge and I looked inside and I thought, well, I could never go in there in the dark. I said, well, that's okay. That's okay. If you don't think you can, then don't do it. You can stay outside and be the gatekeeper, unless you want to overcome the fear. Anyway, I won't go into more details, but she's changed. We got her to get in. The spirits guided me to open the door at the right time, etc. She's so transformed. So this idea of self-hypnosis and being aware of hetero-hypnosis, who's like Rush Limbaugh, right? And I'll send that. Let me know. I'll Dropbox those.
Yeah, very interested.
Yeah, just send me the email. And so I couldn't get it published at the time because Rush Limbaugh was so powerful. So that was the only book out of my 24 that I self-published. So this idea of hypnosis and truth go together, and then fear has to come into that as well, because why do we tell untruths? When we're fairly sure, most of it isn't a matter of, well, truth is multifaceted and you got these different positions. No, most of us know what's really true, right? I would imagine that, the anger that we have if somebody has done a horrible thing to us, we recognize, me going and killing that person because of what they did. It's not the right thing to do, but we do it anyway, right? We do it anyway, and then we go to jail, right? And we can see what's happening, in the big situation in the East. But we know deep down, this is so horrible, and what happened is so horrible, and there's got to be some responsible accountability for it. But it would be wrong if I take that person's life like they took the life of this person, right? Yeah. And you wind up with the Ella Dolores story, and instead of punishing or alienating, you adopt and bring into family, and then that person winds up being one of the great Lakota leaders, helping many, many people. So,
right, so it seems there's an emphasis on healing versus punishing, right? In our culture, it's a culture I personally think is conflicted about whether what we're interested in is punishing or whether we're interested in rehabilitation, and so we end up in this kind of netherworld of punishing people, and there's something in that precept 18, where you're separating the person from the act. And I really like that. And it seems to me in our culture, and it goes right to the noun-based versus verb-based language, right? So that's an evil person. I can still hear George Bush saying the evil doers, like they are evil, versus people do things that you could characterize as evil. But that person is still a sacred being.
Yeah, somebody called me up. I was Howard Tice, who's a Jungian psychologist, and he asked me during the heat of the Donald Trump election process, and he had just watched Democracy Now's interview with the guy who is his 35-year-long biographer, saying this man Donald Trump is not just dangerous for the United States if he gets elected, but for the world, right? And he went on and on. So he said, FourArrows, but the vitriol and this what you're saying about the separation of the person.
Yeah.
He says, can you say something on my tape recorder? Just 1 minute I can put on the YouTube. And essentially, I said there, but for the grace of God, go us, right? If I'd have had the same parents, if I'd have had the same teachers, who knows that I wouldn't be behaving in a way like that. And I gave some story to talk about that, right? And so, I think that's an important thing to point to, the spirituality that Drew brought up. If you truly believe that you are a spirit inhabiting this body, and that in some ways, in all indigenous cultures that I've studied, believe that there is a continuation, and their Preceptive Studies program at the University of Virginia, where Ian Stevenson did his work before he died. There's been a Nobel Peace Prize winner of quantum physics saying that their research is as good as anything in quantum physics. And it's all about life after death, right? I've had a near-death experience, so I can speak to it personally, but so have thousands of others. So if we are spirits, and we don't know, it's a great mystery, but we continue, then we can see that the mistakes we make from the illusions that we draw from our amazing imaginations that allow us to tell untruths, that allow us to live untruths, that allow us to do horrible things to ourselves and others, that it's easier for what you're saying, Kurt, to happen if we recognize that spirit. But we also have to recognize, and I guess maybe, the Eastern traditions get to this a little bit with the idea of karma, that, we have to be responsible, and that we will be held responsible in some way. So spirit goes with truth. Truth relates to fear, and all of them have to do with the phenomenon of how our believing in a belief can create our reality, which is, the word that is best used for research is hypnosis.
Interesting. I can hear how all of it, it's all tied together. I mean, it's really all tied together. And there's a world here that we want to get ourselves reconnected to. I mean, I can really hear that. You say nature is the first and foremost teacher of how things are in the world. Neither nature nor animals lie about reality. Now, here's my question. So for us human beings with this phenomenal ability called language, we seem to have, I look out my window and I see, the rhododendron and the pine tree and all the different plants that are out there, except that they all live for me as a language act, right? So there's my relationship to that world is mediated, if you will, by language, right? So then my question is, how do we, and I think this fits in with everything that we've been talking about so far, how do we experience that language, the truth in nature and animals that aren't lying about reality? How
great question.
Access to that?
Great question, and it relates to hypnosis in a way, in terms of mind and brainwave frequencies, if we want to get technical like that. Yeah. And I want you to think of the word telepathy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, David Abrams, I don't know if you've read his book, Spell of the Sensuous.
I've started it, but I'm not very far into it.
Yeah. So David, he came to the Sundance with me a number of years ago, and afterwards we went to my home on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and we've got 300 islands right out our door. We're on Tokwa Indian land, and David and I went out, and David said to me, "So can we go around that island over there?" And I said, "Yeah, we can do that in about 3 or 4 hours and be back." And he said, "Let's do it. We're on stand-up paddleboards." And he said, "And let's not be able to say a single word of English or any language that we know. We can only make sounds." And I said, "Yeah, let's do it, man." So we did 4 or 5 hours. And we came upon whales and starfish and sea lions and beautiful things here and there, and it was all like if somebody would have seen us, they'd have thought we were insane, man. And we came back then, and we sat down and had made dinner and ate it and talked about how it was different than if we had gone out and talked. All right, so with that little story in mind, what just popped into my brain, when I was, after my near-death experience on the Rio Urique in Mexico, and after 15 years of trying to figure out how the transformations that I had came about, I went back when I learned about the Fantas drug cartel killing those Tarahumara Indians that had saved my life. So when I went back, I got the Smithsonian Institute gave me the name of Edmund Bustia, who was a Tarahumara Mexican winner of the Goldman Environmental Award. And Edwin said, if you want to be with people that have no exposure to Western culture or religion, it's going to be really hard. It's a 3 to 4 day arduous hike down into this valley. But if you do it, there's a guy named Agustin Ramos. He's a 102-year-old shaman. And if you can touch bases with him, he'll take care of you. And you'll be able to write your stories about the problems that the drug cartel is causing, which was my goal, to be able to help out. My wife said, "What do you can't go down by yourself and fight a drug cartel." I said, "No, I want to tell the story of what's happening." And so I went. Long story short, you can go on YouTube and put in FourArrows, The Shaman's Message, Part 1, 2, and 3. And you'll see National Geographic wanted the story, but when I sent them my photos, they laughed. They were in a little Minolta camera. Yeah. So I took the pictures and narrate the 2 trips into Copper Canyon. And you can see this quite amazing story, if I don't say so myself, magical. And the magical part of it mostly, I'll give this away to you. For the first 2 weeks, Augustine ignored me. And I was making friends with his grandchildren and stuff like that. But, I just kept following him. And he would walk up to 15, 20 miles a day, 102-year-old man. And then he would carry these logs that they used for plowing. And I would help and plant seeds. And, you'll see this all in the photographs in the narrative. But then one day, he touched my heart and spoke to me. Now, he spoke to me in his language, and then he would look at me and talk in his language, and I didn't understand it. But one day, we went about 15 miles to a family where a little girl was in fever, and he was brought to heal her. So now I want you to imagine this, and your listeners to this are going to go, "Hey, I don't know about this podcast. They got some weird guys on here." So, but here goes, because this is the answer to your question about the flowers.
Okay. All right.
I believe. So he went in with his healing, and I had seen him with a peyote bulb blowing into it and giving people highs. I've seen a lot of things that he could do. But he went in, so I didn't know what he was doing. I stayed out with the rest of the family and helped shuck corn. We were all sitting on the dirt. He came back out and joined us and started healing it. And I heard the little girl talking with her brothers, and he said she's okay, to the family, I guess. And they all, hugged him and went back to shucking their corn. And then all of a sudden, he tells me what had happened. Now I want you to hear, I'm going to say it the way, what the story is. He said, well, the two brothers of hers had her over on the hill over there where there was like 1,000-foot drop off. And they were teasing her by holding her and pushing her over and pulling her back. And one of her souls left. So I just had to bring that soul back, and now she's okay. Now that's a pretty complex series of words, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about sitting on the couch with your loved one, and you just look at each other and you're saying, without words, saying, I love you. Almost everybody would get that that's what's being said. They're not saying, take out the garbage. They're saying, I love you. So that's telepathic, right? Can we call that telepathic? That's a telepathic, transfer of the idea of saying, I really love being with you. I love you, something like that. Now imagine being told what I just told you. He told me with his lips closed, because he didn't know my language and I didn't know his.
Yeah.
I got all of that from him. I got back to my camp that night, and I never forgot when I came back to the United States weeks later. There must be 14 clicks on me trying to describe it. I go, well, I got back and Augustine described to me what click. Well, he didn't exactly describe it. Click, 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 right? Well, to make the long story short, when Edmund Bustillo came back at the very end of my trip to serve as a translator, he had heard about all the stuff and the relationship that I had with Augustine. And I had to ask in real time, was he talking telepathically to me? Because where did I get all this information, right? And Edmund smiled, knowing apparently, and he asked the question, and Augustine said, I talked heart to heart, is all he said. I talked to heart, corazón, in Spanish, but in his language, I don't know how to say it. But I've learned since then, because he's passed on, I've learned since then from a number of shamans that all of us used to talk telepathically with the animals and the plants and the trees. How else, if anybody knows about the ayahuasca plant, ayahuasca doesn't work unless you boil two plants together, because the one that causes the hallucinations that bring us into seeing our DNA history, the human body stops it from going to the brain. So you have to mix it with a substance from another plant that deters the human barrier to that going to the brain. Well, with all the 300 plants, there was not hit or miss, right? So when you talk to the people, they say, well, how on earth did someone figure out that this plant would do that in the first place, but it wouldn't do it unless you mix it with that plant over there, and they're not even, the answer is the plants talk to us. And so we're so far away from accepting that. But I could tell you a dozen stories of animals that have visited me on ombleches, on things that have, I could just tell you, and so could a lot of others who have finally moved into this place, right? And it took a near-death experience for it to happen to me, so I know it's probably not that easy. But ultimately, if we do this work, and maybe a good way to end our conversation would be something that is not a good way to end it. But the spirits are telling me that this might be worth saying, at least, because your listeners who are even empathetic to this, at some point in their mind, they're going to think, this is all Pollyanna. This is way too impossible, right? Drew, you nodded, and I kind of get to see that's, well, it's true. And I think I might have mentioned this, but for this because of this particular conversation that we've had, it might be important to say it again if I did. But when I was up at UBC before the pandemic, I was asked after I was presenting at the education program, people said, if we begin this worldview reflection process and this chance-based transformation process, do you think we can turn things around? And I said, no.
Yeah.
Remember I told you that?
Yep.
Yeah. And so I think this idea of redefining hope, and I don't know that it can't be, it's possible. I just don't think the probability is, and I think it's a bit of a delusion to think that we can with the efforts that we're making. But if we redefine hope, as Vaclav Havel did, as not the certainty of an outcome, but the certainty that what we're doing is on the right path, regardless of the outcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. And I've had a number of activists who have, and a lot of the students from UB they went from hating me, loving me to hating me in that moment, I had said. But I've gotten emails from them saying, I kind of get that now. And I'm doing a whole thing with Margaret Wheatley first of November. And she's very strong on pushing what she calls hope. She's got some word she has coined that makes hope not so good. And so, wow, that goes against a lot of stuff I've learned about the importance of hope. Right. But it's a different kind of hope. It's just a different way of understanding that we are spirits inhabiting a body, and that there's this longer term thing, and that the time that we're seeing might be just much smaller, and it might be like, accidentally hitting a deer, and you got to get over it. Right. Maybe, I don't know, but I just know that I have felt stronger for it, and my work, I've put more time in on my work with that belief than I think I would have, if I had this is going to work. This is going to turn out okay. The verdict is going to be honest and truthful. No, the chances of any verdict in any court in the Western culture of it being true, my daughter's working for the Innocence Project, and, she's telling me these stories of people in jail for 40 years, she's getting off, but if you can have, these prisoners have that kind of view, the ones that survive, right? Mm-hmm. So we got the intuition, we got the truth, we got the fearlessness, we've got the worldview precepts to balance. Yeah. And we can do that with the hope that it's the right thing to do, then maybe we won't look like these post-apocalyptic movies that just start from where we left off. Maybe we'll be able to start with, the people who are watching this podcast.
Great. Great. Thank you.
Oh. Carolyn, anything for closing? It's just, I have to tell you, it's just so, I can't tell you how fun it is. I guess fun's the best word. Yeah, and to be, and I just got the most wonderful letter from Jim Maddenley. I'll send it to you. All right. Really and Mark Sorensen, Carolyn is in a project that I'm working on right now on the global oneness, and so if you get a chance to talk to him about it, that'd be cool. All right, we didn't open with a prayer, so can I close with one?
Sure.
Otokashila wakantaka nama gombo na tewa topa unshimaka hitu ayam kelo. Chanko luto ochlamani owi chakiapo hetu itozani washte unyo epikte. Oyate oyasin chanko luto ognamani owi chakiapo. Oyate oyasin unchi wichalapon owi chakiapo hetu itozani washte unyo epikte. Ihani lako wijoanki tunkashi the kiksu matako oyasi. All right, my friends, you stay well.
Thank you, FourArrows.
Thank you.